The safe wasn't what made Ethan freeze. It was the name engraved beneath a century of dust. A sharp metallic click echoed through the mansion as Ethan reached for the iron handle. Shadow's ears snapped forward, his low growl filling the silent hallway. Cold air drifted through a crack in the stone, carrying the smell of aged cedar. Whatever had been sealed away was finally within reach, but someone else was already closing in. What do you think is waiting behind that door? The cemetery sat high above the valley, where the pines bent under a restless October wind. Clouds rolled low across the mountains, turning the afternoon sky the color of old steel. Ethan Brooks remained beside the fresh grave long after everyone else had driven away. His hands rested on the worn handle of a shovel someone had forgotten to collect, while Shadow lay quietly beside his boots, ears alert but eyes fixed on his master. The silence felt unfamiliar. For nearly 4 years, Ethan's days had revolved around oxygen tanks, medication schedules, and late-night conversations with his younger brother, Daniel. Every morning had begun with checking a pulse instead of checking the weather. Every night had ended in the same chair beside the hospital bed after Daniel's illness made it impossible for him to climb the stairs of the old farmhouse. Now there was nothing left to do. Shadow slowly stood and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. "I know," Ethan murmured. The old German shepherd's muzzle had turned almost completely gray. Scars crossed one shoulder beneath his thick coat, reminders of another lifetime neither of them ever spoke about. During deployments overseas, Shadow had sensed roadside explosives before machines could detect them. Back home, he had somehow learned to recognize sorrow with the same certainty. Ethan reached down and rubbed behind the dog's ears before walking toward his faded pickup. The drive back to Daniel's property lasted less than 20 minutes. Every curve in the road carried another memory, Daniel laughing as they repaired fences, their father teaching them to split oak logs before winter, their mother hanging quilts across the porch every spring. By the time Ethan turned into the gravel driveway, 3 unfamiliar luxury vehicles were already parked outside. His stomach tightened. A man in a tailored charcoal overcoat stepped off the porch before Ethan even shut off the engine. "Ethan Brooks?" Ethan nodded once. "Gavin Mercer." The man extended a hand. Ethan looked at it but never reached out. "I was Daniel's business partner. I know who you are." Mercer smiled politely without warmth. "I'm sorry for your loss." Shadow remained beside the truck, watching Mercer without blinking. The dog didn't bark. He simply stared. Mercer noticed. "Still protective, I see. He earned that right." Mercer motioned towards the house. "Perhaps we should speak inside." The farmhouse already felt unfamiliar. Boxes lined the hallway. Family photographs had disappeared from the walls. The kitchen table where Ethan and Daniel had eaten breakfast for decades was covered with folders neatly arranged by 2 attorneys wearing expensive suits. One of them adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Brooks, please have a seat." Ethan remained standing. The attorney opened the first folder. "Several months ago, your brother legally transferred ownership of his agricultural holdings into Mercer Rural Development Incorporated." Ethan frowned. "No." The attorney calmly slid several notarized documents across the table. These signatures were witnessed. Ethan stared at Daniel's name. The handwriting looked genuine. His pulse slowed instead of quickening. Combat had taught him that panic narrowed vision. Calm revealed details. He studied every page carefully. Daniel's signature was real, the dates weren't. During 2 of those dates, Daniel had been heavily sedated in hospice care. He would barely have been able to lift a pen. "You filed these while he was dying." Mercer's smile faded only slightly. Daniel understood the financial realities. "No, he wanted the land developed." "No," Mercer leaned against the table. "The ranch was failing. Taxes were mounting. I assumed substantial liabilities. You assumed ownership. I saved what could be saved." Ethan slowly looked around the room. His father's clock was gone. His mother's china cabinet stood empty. Even Daniel's old hunting rifle had disappeared from its place above the fireplace. What exactly is left? One attorney opened a smaller envelope. There is one parcel your brother declined to include. He slid an aged deed across the table. The Black Pine Ridge property. Mercer gave a small laugh. It's practically worthless. Ethan unfolded the brittle paper. The ink had faded almost beyond reading. Mountain Estate, Black Pine Ridge. Original owner, Samuel Brooks. Nearly 140 acres, including an abandoned stone residence. I've never even been there, Ethan quietly said. Most people haven't, Mercer replied. The place has been abandoned for decades. No utilities, structural collapse, wildlife infestation. Frankly, demolishing it would cost more than the land is worth. So you didn't want it. Mercer shrugged. Consider it sentimental value. Ethan folded the deed carefully and slipped it into his jacket. Anything else? The checking account has already been closed. The equipment, liquidated. The livestock, sold. The truck? Mercer smiled. That's yours. Outside, the wind pushed dead leaves across the porch. Shadow suddenly stepped between Ethan and Mercer. The old shepherd's ears flattened. A low growl barely escaped his throat. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Mercer instinctively took half a step backward. Ethan rested one hand gently on Shadow's neck. It's okay. The dog relaxed, but never looked away from Mercer. Ethan picked up his worn backpack from beside the door. His military toolbox followed. Nothing else remained. He paused one final time inside the farmhouse. The walls echoed differently without furniture. It already belonged to strangers. He walked outside without looking back. As he loaded the truck, the first cold drops of rain struck the windshield. The mountains disappeared behind thick curtains of gray. A violent crack of thunder exploded overhead. Before thought could catch up with instinct, Ethan dropped flat beside the truck's rear tire. His heart pounded, his breathing shortened, his eyes searched ridgelines that no longer existed. Incoming. Find cover. Locate the source. Shadow immediately pressed against him. Licking the side of his face, the next heartbeat brought him back. No helicopters, no radio traffic, no smoke, only rain. Ethan slowly pushed himself upright. His jeans were soaked with mud. Mercer watched silently from beneath the porch roof. Neither man spoke. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat. Shadow settled beside him with a tired sigh. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Finally, Ethan unfolded the old deed once more. His thumb traced the faded words. Black Pine Ridge, abandoned stone residence. He glanced once in the rearview mirror. Mercer still stood on the porch, watching, not waving, watching. Ethan quietly started the engine. The pickup rumbled onto the county road, carrying everything he still owned: a backpack, a toolbox, an old dog, and a forgotten key to a place nobody else seemed willing to keep. As the farmhouse disappeared behind the rain, Ethan couldn't shake one question. If Black Pine Ridge was truly worthless, why had Gavin Mercer smiled when he handed it over? The question stayed with Ethan for the next 6 hours as the highway slowly surrendered to winding mountain roads. Rain gave way to patches of sunlight that spilled across endless forests, then disappeared behind another wall of clouds. Civilization grew smaller with every mile. Gas stations became rare. Cell service faded until the signal bars vanished completely. Shadow remained unusually alert. Instead of sleeping across the passenger seat as he usually did on long drives, the old German shepherd sat upright, nose pressed near the open window. Every few minutes, his ears shifted toward sounds Ethan couldn't hear. The old pickup climbed steadily into higher elevations. Black Pine Ridge. The name appeared once on a weathered wooden sign, half hidden behind overgrown brush. The paint had peeled away years ago. Beyond it, the paved road ended. Ethan shifted into four-wheel drive. The narrow dirt trail twisted between towering pines that blocked much of the afternoon light. Fallen branches forced him to stop twice and clear the path with a folding saw from his toolbox. Each time, Shadow stepped out first, quietly scanning the woods before Ethan followed. Old habits. Neither of them questioned them anymore. A pair of ravens burst from the trees ahead. Shadow froze, his eyes focused somewhere deeper in the timber. Ethan followed the dog's stare. Nothing moved. Still, the woods no longer felt empty. He drove another mile before the forest suddenly opened. The mansion stood alone above the valley like a forgotten fortress. Massive stone walls rose from a granite ridge overlooking hundreds of acres of abandoned timberland. Time had punished every part of it. One chimney leaned dangerously toward the eastern slope. Large sections of the slate roof had collapsed inward. Vines climbed across cracked windows and wrapped themselves around heavy stone columns supporting a porch that sagged under decades of snow. It wasn't beautiful, it was stubborn. The structure looked less abandoned than unfinished, as though it had simply been waiting. Ethan shut off the engine. Neither he nor Shadow moved. Wind whispered through broken windows somewhere above. Loose shutters knocked softly against old stone. No other sound disturbed the mountains. "No wonder nobody wanted you," Ethan quietly said. Shadow climbed down first. Instead of walking toward the front steps, the dog circled the mansion at a slow, deliberate pace. Ethan frowned. "You found something?" Shadow ignored the front entrance completely. The old shepherd sniffed around the foundation, paused beneath shattered windows, then continued toward the rear of the building. Ethan followed. The front porch creaked loudly beneath its own weight. Several support beams had already snapped. One hard step probably would have sent the entire structure crashing into the weeds below. Shadow never even looked at it. He stopped beside an old service entrance built into the rear stone wall. The heavy oak door hung crooked on rusted hinges, unlike the front entrance. The surrounding masonry showed surprisingly little damage. Shadow sat, then looked directly at Ethan. "You want this way?" The dog simply waited. Ethan smiled faintly. "Let on," using a pry bar from his toolbox. Ethan forced the swollen door open just enough to squeeze through. Cold air drifted from the darkness. The smell surprised him. Old wood, stone, dust, but very little decay. His flashlight beam swept across a large kitchen whose cast-iron stove still stood against one wall. Broken shelves littered the floor, yet the thick stone walls had protected much of the room from weather. Ethan instinctively paused beside the doorway, his breathing slowed. Left corner, right corner, ceiling, doorway, window, clear. Only after completing the silent routine did he realize what he had done. Afghanistan, room every day. Shadow walked ahead without making a sound. The dog's nails clicked softly against worn flagstone before disappearing into a long hallway. Another click echoed somewhere overhead. Metal, sharp. Instantly, Ethan's shoulders tightened. For one impossible heartbeat, he smelled diesel fuel and burning concrete. Someone shouted over a radio, "Rotor blades, incoming." His hand reached for a rifle that hadn't hung across his chest in nearly a decade. Instead, his fingers closed around empty air. Shadow returned immediately. The shepherd pressed against Ethan's leg until the memory dissolved. The clicking came again, a loose metal gutter outside, nothing more. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Still working on me," he whispered. Shadow rested his head briefly against Ethan's hand before continuing deeper inside. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through broken roof beams, painting long golden stripes across the grand entrance hall. Despite years of neglect, Ethan noticed something remarkable. The foundation hadn't shifted. Cracks climbed through plaster walls, but the supporting stone remained square. He crouched beside one massive interior column and brushed away layers of dust. Solid granite, hand-cut, remarkably level. Whoever built this place knew exactly what they were doing. He spent the next hour exploring a collapsed library, an enormous dining room, bedrooms open to the sky, a staircase that still felt surprisingly stable despite missing sections of railing. Everywhere he looked, the mansion seemed to whisper the same message. Fix me, not save me, fix me. As sunset painted the mountains orange, Ethan returned outside to unload supplies. When he turned back toward the house, something caught his attention. Fresh tire tracks, 2 distinct sets, far newer than his own. They crossed the muddy clearing before disappearing into weeds near the tree line. He knelt beside them. The edges remained sharp. Less than a week old, maybe newer. Shadow stood beside him, hackles slowly rising. Ethan scanned the surrounding forest, the ridgelines, the tree line, the shadows between enormous pines. Nothing. Yet the sensation refused to leave. Someone else had stood exactly where he was standing, recently, someone who hadn't stayed long. As darkness settled over Black Pine Ridge, Ethan carried his backpack inside through the rear entrance. He spread a sleeping bag across the cleanest section of stone floor and lit a small camping lantern. Shadow refused to lie down, and the old shepherd positioned himself beside the service door, facing the woods beyond the broken threshold. Watching, listening, waiting. Ethan glanced once more toward the darkness outside. The mountain had welcomed him, but it hadn't been abandoned. Not completely. That thought lingered in Ethan's mind through most of the night. The mountain never became truly silent. Branches rubbed against one another high above the roof. Somewhere down the slope, a coyote called into the darkness before another answered farther away. Water dripped steadily through broken stone into rusted buckets someone had left decades earlier. Shadow never slept deeply. Every hour the old shepherd quietly stood, walked to the doorway, sniffed the cold air, then returned beside Ethan's sleeping bag. Just before dawn, Ethan opened his eyes without knowing why. Years of military service had trained him to wake seconds before first light. The lantern had burned out hours earlier. Only a pale blue glow seeped through cracked windows. He listened. Nothing. Still, instinct pulled him to his feet. Without thinking, he followed the same routine he had repeated countless mornings overseas. Boots, flashlight, pocket knife, quick visual sweep. Doorways first, corners second, windows last. His heartbeat stayed slow, clear. Shadow waited beside the service entrance before slipping outside. The mountain air carried the sharp scent of pine and frost. Their breath drifted like smoke. Ethan walked the perimeter of the mansion, while Shadow ranged 20 yards ahead, moving through brush with surprising grace for a dog nearly 11 years old. The fresh tire tracks remained. He crouched again. Rain hadn't washed them away. No new tracks had appeared. Whoever had visited wasn't camping nearby. They had come, looked, left. He filed the observation away. Military habits never really disappeared. Every unusual detail belonged somewhere, even if its meaning came later. By mid-morning, Ethan had already built a list. Secure one dry room, repair part of the roof, find water, locate firewood, forget the rest. Trying to rebuild the entire mansion before winter would be impossible. Trying to survive wasn't. He climbed onto the lowest section of roof carrying only tarps, rope, and salvaged boards gathered from collapsed interior walls. Every movement was deliberate. He tested each beam before trusting his weight. Twice he backed away from sections that looked solid but sounded hollow beneath his boots. Combat engineers learned quickly that appearances killed careless people. Structures always told the truth if someone listened. Shadow remained below, pacing wherever Ethan worked overhead. Near noon, the dog suddenly barked once, short, sharp, not fear, warning. Ethan immediately froze. A heartbeat later, one rotten rafter snapped beneath his left foot. He threw his weight backward just as half the roof collapsed into the room below with a deafening crash. Dust exploded through shattered windows. For several seconds, everything disappeared inside a gray cloud. When it settled, Ethan climbed carefully back down. He scratched Shadow behind the ears. "You've still got better timing than I do." The dog's tail thumped once against the ground. They spent the afternoon salvaging usable lumber. Most boards had rotted beyond repair. Some remained surprisingly strong. By sunset, Ethan had sealed one corner bedroom beneath heavy tarps and reinforced enough flooring to safely sleep above the damp ground. It wasn't comfortable, it was dry. That mattered more. The following morning he drove into the nearest town. Black Pine Ridge barely qualified as a community, a weathered gas station, one diner, a feed store, an old lumber yard surrounded by stacks of rough-cut pine. As Ethan loaded discounted plywood into his truck, someone behind him spoke. "You the fellow living up at the Brooks mansion?" Ethan turned. The man looked well into his 70s, broad shoulders, gray beard, suspenders covered in sawdust. His handshake was rough enough to sand wood. "Walter Hayes, Ethan Brooks." Walter glanced toward the overloaded pickup. "Didn't think anybody would ever move back into that place. I'm beginning to understand why." Walter chuckled. "Roof still trying to kill people?" "It made one attempt this morning. Means she likes you." Ethan smiled for the first time in days. Walter nodded toward a pile of lumber stacked behind the mill. "Commercial job canceled last month. Got more leftover framing lumber than I know what to do with. I'm afraid I can't afford much. I didn't ask you to buy it." Ethan looked at him carefully. Walter shrugged. "If I haul it away, I pay disposal fees." He paused. "If somebody happened to take it off my hands, I'd probably sleep better." The old sawmill owner walked away before Ethan could answer. An hour later, the pickup carried enough usable lumber to reinforce half the mansion's first floor. Not charity, just mountain people solving mountain problems. On the drive home, Ethan noticed another surprise. A covered casserole dish rested on the passenger side step when he reached the mansion. No vehicle, no note. Only warm chicken stew wrapped beneath a thick towel. Shadow sniffed it, approved. Ethan scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The following evening, another meal appeared. Fresh biscuits, apple preserves. Still no note. On the third visit, he finally caught sight of an older woman climbing into an aging ranch truck. She smiled before he could speak. "You look like somebody who keeps forgetting supper." "I'm Ethan, Martha Collins." She pointed toward the valley below. "My family's place is about 3 miles east. You didn't have to do this, I know." She started her engine. "My husband served in Vietnam." Her smile softened. "Sometimes folks don't need questions, only company." Then she drove away. That night, Ethan sat beside a small fire inside the repaired room while Shadow slept nearby. Steam rose from another bowl of Martha's stew. Outside, snowflakes drifted quietly through moonlight. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the mansion felt slightly less empty. Then Shadow lifted his head. His ears locked toward the western ridge. Ethan quietly extinguished the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room. He moved to the nearest window without making a sound. Far beyond the clearing, a tiny reflection flashed between the trees. Once, twice, glass catching moonlight, binoculars, or a camera lens. The figure disappeared before Ethan could focus. By the time he reached the porch with his flashlight, only darkness remained beneath the towering pines. Someone had been watching the mansion, and now they knew it wasn't empty anymore. Ethan waited nearly 15 minutes before lowering his flashlight. The woods remained perfectly still. No footsteps, no engine, no snapping branches, only the whisper of wind moving through tall pines. Shadow stood beside him, nose lifted toward the western ridge. The old shepherd's body stayed tense long after the mysterious reflection had vanished. "They're gone," Ethan said quietly. Shadow didn't seem convinced. The next morning, Ethan followed the ridge where he had seen the flash. He moved carefully, placing each boot where leaves covered exposed rock to avoid unnecessary noise. Years spent searching mountain villages overseas had taught him to notice what didn't belong. Broken fern, compressed moss, fresh boot print. About 200 yards from the mansion, he found one. The tread was clean and sharp. Modern hiking boot, not his. He crouched beside it, measuring its length against his gloved hand. One person, heavy enough to leave a clear impression despite the dry ground. The trail continued another 30 yards before disappearing onto exposed granite. Whoever had watched the mansion knew enough to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Ethan looked across the valley. Observation point. Good visibility, easy escape. Someone had chosen it deliberately. He said nothing on the walk back. Instead, he added another habit to his daily routine. Every morning, before beginning repairs, he spent 5 quiet minutes studying the ridgelines with an old pair of binoculars he had found inside Daniel's truck. Nothing. Every evening before dark, he repeated the same scan. Still nothing. 3 days passed. The mansion slowly became more livable. Walter's lumber reinforced sections of the first-floor ceiling. Rain no longer poured directly into Ethan's sleeping area. A rusted rain barrel provided enough water for washing and cooking after every storm. Shadow even claimed a permanent place beside the rebuilt fireplace. For the first time since arriving, Ethan allowed himself to imagine surviving the winter. That illusion disappeared just after lunch on the 4th day. The distant hum of an expensive engine echoed through the valley. Shadow heard it first. He stood immediately. A low growl vibrated deep in his chest. Ethan stepped onto the porch just as a black luxury SUV climbed the rough mountain road, its polished finish looking absurd against the mud and broken stone. The vehicle stopped several yards from the house. A man in his early 40s stepped out wearing polished leather boots that clearly had never walked through mountain dirt. His navy overcoat probably cost more than Ethan's pickup. He smiled confidently. "Mr. Brooks?" Ethan remained on this porch. "You found me. I'm Neil Stanton." The man extended a business card, Director of Acquisitions for Highland Horizon Development. Ethan accepted the card, but didn't read it. "What brings you all the way out here?" Neil glanced toward the mansion. "Beautiful property. It has holes in the roof. It has potential. So does every abandoned building." Neil laughed politely. "I'll get straight to the point." He opened a leather folder. "My company would like to purchase your estate." Ethan looked at him for several seconds. "You drove 4 hours to buy this?" "Yes, it's not for sale." Neil's smile barely changed. "You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. We're prepared to pay $400,000. Silence settled across the clearing. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan almost smiled. $400,000 for a collapsing mansion everyone else had ignored for decades. "You've never seen the inside. We've reviewed enough information." "No." Neil blinked. "I'm sorry, I said no." The executive adjusted his tie. "Mr. Brooks, perhaps you misunderstand. The house is condemned. Restoring it could cost far more than it's worth. I'm still not selling. You could start over anywhere. I already have." Neil studied Ethan carefully, then his eyes drifted toward Shadow. The old shepherd stood quietly beside the porch steps, watching, waiting. Neil cleared his throat. "If you change your mind, I won't." The executive sighed before closing the folder. "I'll leave my card." He turned toward the SUV. Halfway there, he stopped. "You know," his voice remained calm, "sometimes old properties attract unnecessary attention." Ethan said nothing. "I'd hate to see you dealing with trespassers." The SUV rolled away moments later. Dust slowly settled across the clearing. Shadow remained staring at the road long after the vehicle disappeared. That evening, Ethan unfolded the business card beneath his lantern. No local address, corporate headquarters, Denver. He tucked it into his pocket beside the deed Gavin had handed him. 3 mornings later, another vehicle appeared. This time it wasn't an executive, it was a delivery truck. The driver handed Ethan a sealed envelope requiring no signature. Inside sat a single sheet of paper, $550,000, cash purchase, valid for 72 hours. No explanation, no personal note, only a phone number. Ethan folded it once, then twice. Finally, he used it to help start the evening fire. Shadow watched the paper curl into ash. 2 nights later, someone cut the chain securing Ethan's fuel cans. Nothing had been stolen. The cans simply lay scattered across the yard. The following afternoon, several newly installed roof braces had been loosened. Not enough to collapse, just enough to fail under heavy snow. Someone wanted Ethan to notice. Not enough damage to call the sheriff, just enough to send a message. Walter arrived that weekend with another truckload of lumber. He examined the loosened braces without saying a word. Finally, he looked at Ethan. "You make any enemies lately? I inherited one." Walter nodded slowly. "Folks around here usually ignore Black Pine Ridge, I've noticed. Not anymore." Walter climbed back into his truck before pausing. "My father always said people don't throw money at something worthless." Ethan watched the truck disappear down the mountain road. As evening settled over the valley, he walked alone around the mansion's perimeter. Every damaged brace, every cut chain, every footprint. Individually, they meant very little. Together they formed a pattern, not random vandalism, careful pressure, testing, watching, waiting. He looked toward the highest ridgeline where he had first seen the camera flash. "They're trying to make me leave," he whispered. Shadow quietly stepped beside him. The old shepherd's ears suddenly turned toward the eastern wall of the mansion, not toward the woods, toward the house itself. For several long seconds, the dog stared at the towering stone chimney rising above the roof. Then he slowly walked over, sat beside its massive foundation, and refused to move. Ethan watched him for nearly a minute. "Come on, partner." Shadow didn't react. The old German shepherd lowered his nose to the stone floor, inhaled slowly, then scratched once at the base of the chimney with one heavy paw, not digging, not playing, marking. Ethan walked over and rested his hand against the cold granite blocks, solid, nearly 4 feet thick. Unlike much of the mansion, the chimney showed almost no settling. Its mortar joints remained tight despite decades of neglect. He knocked once with his knuckles. Stone answered with a dull, heavy thud. Nothing unusual. "You smell mice?" Shadow scratched again. One deliberate scrape. Then he lay down directly beside the chimney, refusing to follow Ethan back toward the work area. The behavior continued the next morning, and the morning after that. No matter where Ethan worked, Shadow eventually wandered back to the chimney and settled beside it like a silent guard. After 4 days, Ethan finally laughed. "If you're waiting for the fireplace to cook breakfast, you're about 50 years too late." The dog only blinked. Ethan returned to repairing the second-floor hallway. Winter was moving down from the higher peaks much faster than expected. Every morning frost coated broken windows. By afternoon, icy winds swept through the empty rooms with a mournful whistle. He spent long hours replacing fractured floor joists using lumber Walter had provided. The work demanded complete concentration. Measure, cut, fit, test, repeat. Simple tasks kept intrusive memories quiet until sudden sounds interrupted them. A loose sheet of slate slid off the roof one afternoon and exploded against the rocks below. Before the echo faded, Ethan had already dropped behind a stone wall, heart racing, breathing shallow, eyes scanning windows that overlooked no battlefield. Only mountains. Shadow quietly walked over and leaned against his shoulder. No command. No panic, just steady pressure until Ethan's breathing slowed. "I hate that it still happens," Ethan whispered. The dog licked the back of his hand once. The following evening, Martha Collins arrived carrying another casserole wrapped inside thick towels. She noticed Ethan replacing cracked porch supports. "Looks different every time I come, trying to stay one step ahead of winter." She smiled. "You've already done more in 3 weeks than anybody else managed in 30 years. Ethan wiped sawdust from his gloves. "People tried restoring it. Oh, several. What happened?" Martha looked toward the enormous chimney. "They always quit, because no one ever stayed long enough to explain." She climbed back into her truck before adding one last thought. "My husband always believed old houses remember things." She drove away before Ethan could ask what she meant. That night, heavy rain rolled across Black Pine Ridge. Wind slammed against the stone walls. Ancient beams groaned overhead. Ethan lay awake listening. Shadow suddenly jumped to his feet. Every muscle tightened. The shepherd raced toward the great chimney. He barked once, loud, urgent. Ethan grabbed his flashlight. "What is it?" Shadow stood directly beneath a massive crossbeam, supporting part of the damaged roof. The dog barked again, then lunged forward. Instinct overruled thought. Ethan stepped backward. The world exploded. A deafening crack ripped through the mansion as one of the rain-soaked roof beams finally surrendered. Thousands of pounds of timber crashed downward exactly where Ethan had been standing seconds earlier. Dust engulfed the room. Broken slate shattered across the stone floor. The impact shook the entire house. Ethan stumbled against the wall. Shadow, no answer. Panic replaced training. He charged into the cloud of dust, throwing aside splintered boards with both hands. "Shadow!" A faint whine answered somewhere beneath the wreckage. Ethan dropped to his knees. "Combat engineer, think. Wait first. Leverage second." He found an intact oak beam acting as a brace. Using a 6-foot pry bar, he slowly lifted one end while kicking shattered debris away. Another whine. "Closer! There you are!" Shadow crawled free, limping badly. Blood darkened the fur along his left shoulder. A jagged splinter had sliced deeply through muscle but missed the leg itself. Ethan immediately guided the dog into the kitchen. His movements became automatic. Gloves, clean water, pressure dressing, antiseptic. The same field procedures he'd used on wounded soldiers years before. Shadow never growled, never pulled away, only rested his head against Ethan's knee while the wound was cleaned. "I'm sorry, old boy." The shepherd answered by nudging Ethan's wrist. Hours later, the storm finally moved east. Lantern light flickered across the damaged room. Most of the collapsed beam had landed against the massive chimney instead of crushing the floor completely. Something caught Ethan's attention, a draft. Cold air brushed across the back of his hand. He frowned. The fireplace hadn't been open in decades. He held the lantern closer. The breeze wasn't coming through the chimney. It was coming through the stone beside it. He leaned closer. The airflow was faint, barely noticeable, yet impossible. Solid masonry shouldn't breathe. Ethan placed his ear against the granite. Nothing. Then he rapped the wall gently with the wooden handle of his hammer. Thud. He moved 6 inches to the left. Thud. Another 6 inches. Thunk. Different. Hollow. He struck the same spot again. The sound echoed somewhere beyond the stone, not loudly, just enough. His eyes narrowed. He measured the chimney against the room. The proportions suddenly felt wrong, too wide, too deep, as though someone had built far more masonry than a fireplace actually required. Shadow slowly struggled to his feet despite the fresh bandage. Ignoring the pain, the old shepherd walked back to the exact place where he had been scratching for days. He pressed his nose against the stone, then looked at Ethan. Neither moved. The mountain wind whispered softly through cracks high above them. For the first time since arriving at Black Pine Ridge, Ethan stopped thinking like a carpenter trying to repair an old mansion. He started thinking like an engineer trying to solve a puzzle. He waited until dawn before touching another stone. The mountain rewarded patience. In combat, rushing toward a mystery usually meant walking into danger. Old buildings demanded the same respect. Shadow slept near the fireplace, exhausted from the night's injury. Every so often, the old shepherd opened one eye to watch Ethan, then settled back down when he realized his partner wasn't climbing onto another unstable roof. Ethan carried a notebook through every room of the mansion. He measured, recorded, measured again. The front wall, the rear wall, the width of every hallway, the depth of every room. He ignored peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. None of it mattered. Stone never lied. By late afternoon, his notebook contained dozens of numbers. Something refused to fit. He spread the pages across the dining room table beneath the lantern. The exterior of the eastern wing measured nearly 68 feet. The interior, only 54. 14 feet had vanished. He checked his calculations 3 more times. Same answer. The missing space extended almost the entire height of the mansion. Impossible, unless the walls weren't where they appeared to be. The next morning, Ethan drove into town carrying the faded property deed. The Dutchess County Archives occupied 2 rooms inside an aging brick courthouse whose wooden floors creaked beneath every step. Behind the front desk sat a silver-haired clerk wearing reading glasses attached to a blue ribbon. She smiled warmly. "Can I help you? I'm looking for original construction records." She adjusted her glasses. "For what property?" "Black Pine Ridge." Her smile faded into surprise. "I haven't heard anyone ask about that place in years. It still has records?" "Oh, honey." She chuckled softly. "It has boxes." Her name tag read, Linda Evans. She disappeared into the back room and returned pushing a cart loaded with weathered binders tied together by faded cloth straps. "Most people come looking for birth certificates." She patted the first box. "You came looking for history." Hours passed beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Ethan studied century-old survey maps, original tax assessments, building permits signed in elegant handwriting. One oversized blueprint immediately caught his attention. Mountain Residence. Completed 1908. Chief Engineer, Samuel Brooks. He carefully unfolded the brittle paper across the archive table. Every wall, every staircase, every chimney, precisely drawn. His finger followed the eastern side of the mansion. The chimney occupied the center exactly as expected, but one detail made him stop. The blueprint showed a narrow service corridor extending behind the chimney wall. Inside the mansion, no corridor existed. Linda noticed his expression. "Find something interesting?" "I think part of the house disappeared." She laughed. Old buildings have a way of doing that. Ethan borrowed copies of every available drawing before returning to Black Pine Ridge. Clouds gathered overhead as he climbed back into the mountains. By evening, snow drifted lazily through the trees. Inside the mansion, Ethan spread the copied blueprints across the floor. Shadow limped over despite the bandage around his shoulder. The old shepherd placed one paw directly on the drawing where the missing corridor should have been. Ethan smiled. "You're starting to make me believe you planned this." The dog answered with a slow wag of his tail, armed with measurements instead of guesses. Ethan climbed to the second floor. The eastern hallway ended beside the towering chimney. According to the original plans, it shouldn't. He measured the hallway. 41 feet. Blueprint, 55. 14 feet missing. Exactly as before. He tapped carefully along the plaster wall using the wooden handle of his hammer. Solid, 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 then, thunk, he froze. The hollow sound returned, different from every other section. He marked the location with carpenter's chalk. Instead of swinging hard, Ethan removed one strip of cracked molding using a pry bar. Behind it waited rough-cut lath covered by brittle horsehair plaster. Original construction. No repairs. No obvious doorway. He carefully removed another section. Cold air drifted across his fingers, the same draft, stronger now. Shadow suddenly stood, his ears pointed directly toward the opening. The old shepherd gave one quiet bark, not warning, confirmation. Ethan widened the opening another few inches. Behind the plaster stood heavy stone instead of framing. Unusual, the wall itself was nearly 3 feet thick. No ordinary interior partition required that much masonry. He examined the mortar joints. One vertical seam looked subtly different from the rest. The stones aligned perfectly. Too perfectly. Someone had intentionally disguised the joint. He inserted the thin end of his pry bar. Nothing. He tried lower. Still nothing. Then he remembered something from Afghanistan. Many concealed entrances weren't forced. They were balanced. Weight mattered more than strength. He searched the surrounding stones until his hand settled on one block worn smoother than the others. He pressed. Nothing happened. Then he pushed upward. A faint grinding sound echoed deep inside the wall. Stone shifted. Dust floated into the lantern light. A narrow gap slowly appeared where no opening had existed moments before. Cold air poured out, carrying the scent of dry cedar instead of damp decay. Ethan stared silently into the darkness. Shadow limped forward first. The dog stopped at the threshold, sniffed once, then looked back as if asking permission. Easy. Together they stepped through. The hidden passage stretched nearly 20 feet inside the mountain-facing wall. Unlike the rest of the mansion, it remained remarkably clean. No collapsed ceiling, no water damage, no animal nests. Only thick layers of undisturbed dust covering the stone floor. No footprints, not even old ones. At the far end stood a heavy oak door reinforced with black iron straps. The hinges showed almost no rust. Someone had protected this place with extraordinary care. Ethan slowly reached for the iron handle. It didn't move. Locked. He raised the lantern toward the ceiling. Above the doorway, carved into a granite lintel almost hidden beneath decades of dust, were 6 words: "The truth endures longer than fortune." Shadow quietly walked to the base of the door. He sat, then rested one paw against the threshold. Ethan lowered the lantern. His heartbeat echoed softly through the silent corridor. Whatever waited beyond that door had remained hidden for more than 100 years. Ethan rested one hand on the cold iron handle. It refused to move. No keyhole, no visible latch. Only black iron straps crossing thick oak that had somehow escaped the decay consuming the rest of the mansion. Shadow sniffed along the bottom edge of the door before sitting quietly beside Ethan. The shepherd no longer scratched or barked. It was as if he understood. They had finally reached the place he had been trying to find all along. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. The carved words above the doorway caught the light again. The truth endures longer than fortune. He studied the hinges. Unlike modern hardware, each hinge pin disappeared deep into the surrounding granite instead of the doorframe, built to outlast generations. Combat engineers often joked that if someone invested this much effort into a door, whatever waited behind it was worth protecting or hiding. He stepped back. Force wasn't the answer. He returned to the dining room and spread every blueprint across the table again. The hidden corridor appeared only on the earliest drawings. The room beyond it did not so. Someone had intentionally erased it from every later revision. His attention shifted to another folder Linda Evans had insisted he borrow. Personal correspondence. Samuel Brooks, estate engineer. Most of the pages contained supply orders, payroll records, and weather observations. Near the bottom of the stack rested a leather journal wrapped in faded cloth. The first pages described quarry work and bridge construction, then the handwriting changed. June 18, 1919. The war has ended, but peace has not reached every man who returned. I have seen young soldiers awaken screaming at sounds only they can hear. Some wounds leave no scar upon the skin. Ethan stopped reading. Outside, wind brushed softly across broken windows. He turned another page. October 2nd, 1920. Gold invites thieves, land invites greed. Truth invites neither. Therefore, truth must become the strongest thing I leave behind. The final entries grew increasingly technical. Measurements, stone elevations, roof pitch, load calculations. They looked less like diary entries than engineering notes. Shadow quietly walked over and rested his chin across Ethan's knee. Ethan rubbed behind the dog's ears without taking his eyes from the journal. The old man thought like an engineer. Shadow blinked slowly. So do we. He carried the journal back into the hidden corridor. The lantern illuminated every carved stone, every seam, every bolt. Nothing appeared decorative. Everything served a purpose. The journal mentioned 3 numbers repeatedly. 36, 48, 72. Not combinations, dimensions. He measured the granite floor. 36 inches between support pillars. He measured the ceiling beams. 48 feet from entrance to rear wall. The final number remained. 72, he frowned. Roof height? Foundation depth? Then he looked upward. The corridor ceiling consisted of massive timber beams resting across granite walls. Exactly 72 inches above the doorway hung a small iron peg no larger than a nail, almost invisible. He climbed onto an old crate and examined it. The peg moved slightly. Instead of pulling downward, Ethan rotated it clockwise. A deep, metallic click echoed somewhere inside the wall. The sound bounced through the narrow corridor. Sharp, precise. Metal striking metal for an instant. Everything disappeared. The lantern, the stone, the mountain. He stood once again inside a shattered compound in eastern Afghanistan. Metal clanged against armored plating. Someone shouted, "Contact left!" Dust filled the air. The radio crackled. A medic screamed for another tourniquet. Ethan's breathing accelerated. His hands trembled. The smell of cedar vanished beneath memories of smoke and diesel. He reached instinctively toward a rifle that wasn't there. Shadow immediately pressed against him. The shepherd leaned his full weight against Ethan's leg, steady and familiar. No barking, no panic, just presence. Ethan closed his eyes. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. When he opened them again, the corridor returned. Stone, lantern, old wood. I'm here, he whispered. Shadow's tail tapped the floor once. The hidden mechanism had released something. The heavy oak door still hadn't opened. But now a narrow panel beside it had shifted outward. Inside rested a small brass cylinder. Ethan carefully removed it. The cap unscrewed with surprising ease. Rolled inside was another page written in Samuel Brooks's careful script. A fortress is strongest when built upon what cannot move. The mountain carries the house. The house carries the truth. Measure the mountain, not the room. Ethan unfolded the original site survey. Every elevation surrounding the mansion had been carefully documented before construction began. One number appeared repeatedly beside the eastern cliff. Elevation, 4,128 feet. Another beside the granite foundation, bearing 113 degrees. A final notation marked the ridge above. Summit marker, 9, engineering references, not random codes. He turned toward the door again. 3 brass discs had been hidden within the iron straps all along, nearly invisible beneath layers of age. Each rotated independently, the first aligned with elevation, the second with bearing, the third with marker. Ethan slowly turned them. The last disc settled into place with a soft click. Silence. Then something enormous shifted inside the granite. Ancient counterweights awakened after more than a century. Dust drifted from overhead beams. Iron bolts withdrew one after another with deep mechanical thuds. The massive oak door slowly swung inward without a single squeal. Cool, dry air flowed from the darkness beyond. Shadow stood immediately. Neither fear nor excitement showed in his eyes, only certainty. The lantern revealed cedar-paneled walls untouched by moisture, a polished wooden desk, shelves lined with leather-bound journals, and in the center of the hidden chamber, bolted directly into solid mountain granite, stood an enormous black iron safe. Its steel surface reflected the lantern light, as though no time had passed at all. Ethan walked forward slowly. His fingertips brushed the cold metal. Across the front, cast into the iron in raised letters, were the words, Herring Hall Marvin Safe Co. The combination dial remained locked, untouched, waiting. Ethan stood motionless before the enormous safe. The lantern's glow rolled across the black iron surface, revealing tiny scratches around the polished brass dial, but almost no rust. Whoever had sealed this chamber had done it with remarkable care. Shadow limped into the room and slowly circled the safe. His injured shoulder stiffened with every step, yet he insisted on inspecting every corner before settling beside the heavy steel door. Old habits. The room felt secure. Only then did the dog finally lie down. Ethan smiled faintly. You still clear the room before I do. The journals lining the cedar shelves caught his attention before the safe itself. He carefully removed the first volume. Samuel Brooks had written almost every page in neat block letters. The early entries described building the mansion. The later ones described something else entirely. Pressure, visitors asking unusual questions, men attempting to buy the surrounding mountain land for prices that made no sense. One passage had been underlined twice. If this room is ever opened, those seeking these records will not be far behind. Protect the documents. Gold can be replaced. Truth cannot. Ethan quietly closed the journal. His eyes drifted back toward the safe. He finally understood why Samuel had designed puzzles instead of locks. Anyone willing to force the safe would probably never understand what mattered most inside. He reached for the combination dial before his fingers touched it. Shadow's head snapped upward. The old shepherd stood so quickly he stumbled. His ears pointed toward the hidden corridor. A low growl rolled through the chamber. Ethan froze. At first he heard nothing. Then, very faint, an engine. Far below the ridge, not one vehicle, several. He extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only thin bands of daylight filtered beneath the hidden doorway. Shadow moved toward the corridor despite the pain in his shoulder. Every muscle in his body had tightened. Ethan followed. They reached the concealed passage just as another sound drifted upward. Car doors, voices. One slammed shut, then another. He moved silently to the narrow observation slit hidden beside the corridor entrance. Through a gap between loose stones, he could see the clearing below. 3 county vehicles, 1 sheriff's SUV, a white building department truck, and parked behind them. A black luxury SUV. Neil Stanton climbed out first. Behind him stood another man Ethan recognized instantly, Gavin Mercer. So, Ethan whispered, you came yourself. Shadow gave another low growl. Men began walking toward the mansion carrying clipboards instead of tools. The sheriff adjusted his hat, while a heavy-set inspector unfolded several official-looking documents. Even from this distance, Ethan could hear part of the conversation. Unsafe structure. Condemnation, an immediate demolition authority. Gavin remained near the vehicles, hands in his coat pockets. He looked unusually calm. Too calm. The inspector stepped onto the porch and shouted, Ethan Brooks! His voice echoed through the valley. If you're inside, please come out. Ethan remained perfectly still. The inspector continued, by order of the County Building Authority, this structure has been declared an immediate public hazard. A deputy unfolded another paper. You are ordered to vacate the premises immediately. Walter Hayes's pickup suddenly appeared at the end of the road. The old sawmill owner stepped out and looked from the officials to the mansion. What in the world is going on? County business, one deputy replied. Walter glanced toward Gavin. His face hardened. I've lived here 50 years. This property's been standing longer than any building in town. The inspector barely looked at him. We've received engineering reports. Walter snorted. You haven't even gone inside. Neil Stanton quietly whispered something into Gavin's ear. Gavin smiled. That same smile Ethan had worn in his memory ever since the farmhouse. The smile of a man expecting to win. Inside the hidden chamber, Ethan's pulse remained steady. He understood now. They weren't here because the mansion might collapse. They were here because they couldn't allow him time to discover whatever the safe contained. He looked back toward the iron door, the journals, the records, the unopened safe. If county workers entered the hidden room first, every document could disappear into endless legal disputes or vanish forever. He made his decision, not the gold, the papers, always the papers. Samuel had been right. Truth mattered more. He quickly gathered the journals already sitting outside the safe. Survey maps, original blueprints, property ledgers. Every document that could fit inside his waterproof military field pack. The safe itself would have to wait. Outside, heavy boots echoed through the mansion. The deputies had entered. Floorboards creaked. Voices bounced through empty rooms. Ground floor clear. Check upstairs. Shadow suddenly turned toward the western wall. There, an old maintenance tunnel Ethan had noticed weeks earlier while reinforcing the foundation, originally used by workers to reach the lower furnace room. Narrow, hidden, still passable. He slung the pack across his shoulders. Come on. Shadow limped after him. They reached the tunnel entrance just as another crash echoed overhead. The deputies were forcing open interior doors. The tunnel descended steeply beneath the mansion. Stone walls narrowed around them. Halfway through, a deep rumble shook the passage. Dust rained from the ceiling. Someone above had begun striking weakened support beams. Not demolition, searching. Shadow suddenly shoved Ethan sideways with surprising force. A heavy chunk of fractured stone crashed exactly where Ethan had been standing. Another fragment struck Shadow across his already injured shoulder. The shepherd cried out, but remained on his feet. Blood soaked through the fresh bandage. Ethan immediately caught him before he stumbled. No. He tightened one arm beneath the dog's chest. We finished this together. Ignoring the pain in his own bruised shoulder, Ethan supported Shadow through the remaining tunnel until cold mountain air rushed toward them. They emerged nearly 100 yards downhill behind a curtain of dense evergreens. The mansion remained hidden from view. Above them, officials continued shouting inside the empty house. None of them had noticed the hidden exit. Ethan looked back one final time. Black Pine Ridge stood silent against the gray afternoon sky. Whatever Gavin Mercer believed he had come to destroy had already slipped through his fingers. Ethan didn't stop walking until the mansion had disappeared behind the pines. Only then did he lower himself onto a fallen log. Shadow collapsed beside him, breathing harder than usual. The bandage on the old shepherd's shoulder was stained dark with fresh blood. Ethan opened his field pack, clean gauze, saline, medical tape. The familiar rhythm steadied his hands. Years ago, he had treated young soldiers under far worse conditions. Now he spoke to Shadow in the same calm voice he had once used for frightened recruits. You'll be all right. The shepherd never flinched. He simply rested his head against Ethan's boot while the wound was cleaned and wrapped again. By dusk, they reached Martha Collins' ranch. She opened the door before Ethan could knock. One look at Shadow told her everything. My goodness. She knelt immediately beside the old dog. What happened? Long story. I've got coffee. I could use some. Walt Hayes arrived less than 20 minutes later after Martha called him. He listened quietly while Ethan described the county inspection, Gavin's appearance, and the sudden condemnation order. Walter leaned back in his chair. I've repaired mills for 40 years, he shook his head. No county inspector condemns a stone mansion after standing outside for 5 minutes. Martha folded her arms. They already knew what decision they planned to make. They weren't inspecting, Ethan replied. They were removing an obstacle. Walter looked toward the weathered field pack resting beside the kitchen table. You found something. Ethan hesitated. Then he slowly unzipped the pack. Leather journals, original blueprints, survey maps, property ledgers. Walter carefully picked up the oldest survey. His weathered hands trembled slightly. I haven't seen handwriting like this since my grandfather's records. Martha unfolded one blueprint. The hidden corridor. You knew about it? Ethan asked. She smiled faintly. No. But my husband always believed this house had been built with secrets. Walter examined another document. His expression changed. These aren't ordinary construction records. What do you mean? He pointed toward several signatures. These survey lines establish the original property boundaries. Ethan leaned closer. Walter continued. Look here. He traced an old ink line crossing the ridge. The current county map ends at the creek. This one continues another half-mile east. So? Walter looked directly at Ethan. So your land is much larger than anyone claims. Silence filled the room. Martha quietly unfolded another survey. It gets stranger. She pointed toward a seal pressed into the lower corner. United States Department of Agriculture, Forest Conservation Division. Walter frowned. Protected water rights. Ethan remembered Neil Stanton's first offer. $400,000, then $550,000 for a collapsing mansion. It had never been about the mansion. He looked toward the journals. They wanted the land. Walter nodded slowly, and whatever legal rights came with it. The next morning, Ethan drove into town before sunrise. Instead of returning to the mansion, he stopped outside the modest brick office of Claire Donovan, attorney at law. The lights were already on. Claire greeted him with a professional smile that faded the moment she saw the stack of century-old documents. You've been busy. I need someone who understands property law. She invited him inside. For nearly 3 hours, they examined every page. Claire barely spoke while reading. Occasionally, she highlighted a sentence. Sometimes she photographed a signature. Finally, she removed her glasses. Mr. Brooks, she leaned back slowly. Where exactly did you get these? They were hidden inside their mansion. I believe you. She tapped one survey map. Because nobody could fabricate documents like these. She opened another ledger. These records establish continuous ownership. Another page. They also document easements. Another, and mineral restrictions. Ethan frowned. Is that important? Claire laughed softly. It's extremely important. She turned one final page toward him. This notarized agreement predates every modern property transfer, so it means several later deeds, including the one Gavin Mercer relied upon, may be legally defective. The room fell silent. Claire spoke carefully. I'm not saying you've already won, but I am saying someone either ignored these records. She paused, or hoped nobody would ever find them. She organized every document into labeled folders. We'll scan everything today, and the originals, they never leave your possession. Late that afternoon, Ethan and Shadow returned to Black Pine Ridge. County barricades blocked the main road. Bright orange signs declared the property unsafe. From a nearby ridge, Ethan studied the mansion through binoculars. No demolition equipment, no workers, only 2 private security guards parked near the entrance, watching, waiting, guarding an abandoned building. Walter's words echoed in his mind. People don't protect worthless property. As the sun dropped behind the mountains, Ethan lowered the binoculars. Shadow quietly sat beside him. The old shepherd stared toward the hidden eastern wall, where the secret chamber still waited behind centuries-old stone. The safe remained unopened, its contents untouched. Yet somehow the documents already rescued had changed everything. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, Ethan no longer felt like a man defending the last thing he owned. He felt like a man protecting the truth. Someone else had spent generations trying to bury, and somewhere beyond the barricades, Gavin Mercer still believed the greatest secret inside Black Pine Ridge remained locked behind an iron door. He was wrong. The greatest secret had never been the safe. It was the paper trail already resting inside Claire Donovan's office. 3 days later, the county courthouse was unusually crowded. Word had spread through the small mountain community that Ethan Brooks was challenging the emergency condemnation order. Walter Hayes sat quietly in the back row. Martha Collins occupied the seat beside him. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, his injured shoulder healing slowly beneath a fresh bandage. Across the room, Gavin Mercer entered with Neil Stanton and 2 expensive attorneys. He wore the same confident smile Ethan remembered from Daniel's funeral. Claire placed several neatly organized binders on the counsel table. "No surprises," she whispered. "We let the documents speak." The county hearing officer adjusted his glasses. "This proceeding concerns the emergency closure of the Black Pine Ridge estate." The building inspector testified first. He described unstable beams, roof damage, and public safety concerns. Claire listened without interrupting. When it was her turn, she stood and approached the witness with one simple question. "How long were you inside the mansion before declaring it unsafe?" The inspector hesitated. "Approximately." He glanced toward his notes. 5 minutes. You conducted no structural measurements. No. No engineering analysis? No. No foundation inspection. Claire nodded once. "Thank you." A murmur spread through the room. Walter quietly folded his arms. The sheriff testified next. He admitted his office had merely accompanied the inspection because county officials requested assistance. No criminal complaint, no emergency rescue, no independent investigation. Only a request. Claire called Ethan. He described the repairs he had completed, the repeated purchase offers, and the unexplained pressure to sell. Then she introduced the first survey map, the original boundary survey. The hearing officer leaned forward. Claire presented another document, the recorded conservation easement, then another, the original ownership ledger. Each page carried notarized signatures more than a century old. The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire addressed the hearing officer. These records establish continuous ownership and property boundaries inconsistent with later filings. She turned toward Gavin's table. They also demonstrate that several modern transfers relied upon incomplete title records. One of Gavin's attorneys stood immediately. "Objection." "On what basis?" the hearing officer asked. "The authenticity of these documents." Claire calmly handed over certified archive copies obtained from the county records office. The originals remain in Mr. Brooks's possession. She then submitted Linda Evans's affidavit confirming where the archived materials had been located. The objection disappeared almost as quickly as it had been raised. For the first time that morning, Gavin's smile faded. Claire continued. "I would also like to introduce correspondence showing repeated unsolicited purchase offers made immediately before this condemnation." Neil Stanton shifted uneasily in his chair. The hearing officer examined the offers. $400,000. Another page. $550,000. He looked toward Neil. "Your company considered this condemned property worth over $500,000. Neil hesitated. "It had development potential." Claire stepped closer. "So valuable that your representative appeared at the inspection before any demolition decision had even been finalized." Silence. Neil offered no answer. The hearing officer made a note. Claire returned to her table. No further questions. A short recess followed. Outside the courtroom, Ethan stood beside a window overlooking the courthouse lawn. Shadow rested quietly against his leg. Walter joined them. "You did well. I mostly answered questions. Sometimes that's enough." Martha smiled gently. The truth usually doesn't need much decorating. When the hearing resumed, the hearing officer spoke carefully. based upon the evidence presented today. He paused to review several pages. The emergency demolition authorization is suspended pending a complete independent engineering review. Another pause. The property shall remain under the lawful ownership and control of Mr. Ethan Brooks. Relief washed silently across the room. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. Martha reached over to squeeze Ethan's shoulder. Across the aisle, Gavin stood abruptly. "This isn't over." His voice remained controlled, but the confidence had vanished. Claire met his gaze. "No, it isn't." As everyone filed from the courtroom, Gavin stopped beside Ethan. "You've delayed the inevitable." Ethan looked at him steadily. "I've only just begun." Gavin's expression hardened before he walked away. Claire waited until he disappeared down the hallway. "He's worried now about losing." She shook her head. "About what you haven't found yet." Ethan understood immediately. The safe. The journals already rescued had unraveled years of deception. The unopened safe still waited inside the hidden chamber beneath Black Pine Ridge. If Samuel Brooks believed truth mattered more than fortune, then whatever rested behind that iron door might finally explain why powerful men had spent generations trying to erase an abandoned mountain estate from history. 2 mornings later, the county removed the barricades. The court's temporary order gave Ethan full access to the estate until an independent engineering report could be completed. Neil Stanton's security guards were gone. Only fresh tire marks remained in the muddy driveway. Ethan parked quietly beneath the towering pines. For a long moment, he simply looked at the mansion. Broken windows still reflected the pale winter sun. The roof remained scarred from years of neglect. Yet somehow the building no longer felt abandoned. It had survived, just as he had. Shadow stepped from the truck more carefully than before. His shoulder had begun to heal, though his limp remained. Together they climbed the familiar stone steps. Dust covered the entrance exactly as they had left it. Nothing appeared disturbed. The hidden corridor remained untouched. Ethan lit his lantern and walked slowly toward the great iron safe. The black steel door waited in perfect silence. This time there were no engines outside, no footsteps overhead, no voices demanding he leave. Only the quiet breathing of an old dog and the steady crackle of the lantern flame. Ethan placed Samuel Brooks's journal on the cedar desk. The final pages described the safe in surprising detail, not its contents, its purpose. A safe protects objects, a legacy protects people. If the object survives, but the truth is forgotten, the safe has failed. Ethan turned the page. A carefully drawn diagram appeared beneath the writing. The same Herring Hall Marvin safe. Its combination wasn't written as numbers, it was written as measurements. North wall, foundation, sunrise. He smiled, still thinking like an engineer. He walked back into the corridor carrying a tape measure and compass. The first instruction directed him to measure from the northern foundation stone to the center of the chimney. 32 feet. The second required aligning the compass with the winter sunrise marked on Samuel's original survey. The third referenced the elevation line already used to open the chamber. Each answer produced another number, 32, 87, 21, not random, a combination. He returned to the safe. The brass dial turned smoothly despite a century of silence. Left, 3 full rotations. Stop at 32. Right, past 0. Stop at 87. Left again, 21. He wrapped both hands around the polished handle. Nothing, he frowned. Shadow quietly walked to the cedar desk. The old shepherd nudged the journal with his nose. One loose page slipped onto the floor. Ethan picked it up. Only one sentence had been written there. Always finish what you started. He stared at the dial, then laughed softly. I forgot the final turn. One last movement. Right. until the handle stopped naturally. A heavy metallic click echoed through the chamber. The locking bolts withdrew one after another. The sound rolled through the granite walls like distant thunder. The safe door slowly opened. Cool, dry air escaped from inside. No glittering treasure spilled across the floor. No stacks of gold bars. No priceless jewels. Instead, 3 leather document cases rested neatly on the upper shelf. Below them sat several cloth-wrapped bundles, a wooden box, and one small velvet pouch. Ethan opened the first document case. Inside lay original property patents bearing federal seals. Every signature remained perfectly preserved. The second contained correspondence between Samuel Brooks and federal conservation officials. The letters confirmed permanent water rights flowing through Black Pine Ridge, rights that legally prevented commercial development across much of the valley. The third case held something even more remarkable. A signed confession, dated decades earlier, written by Gavin Mercer's own grandfather. The elderly businessman had admitted participating in a fraudulent transfer designed to conceal portions of the Brooks property after Samuel's death. He described forged boundary maps, missing survey pages, bribed officials. At the bottom appeared 2 witness signatures and a notary seal. Ethan slowly lowered the document. So that's what you've been hiding. He carefully opened the wooden box. Inside rested military medals, a bronze star, a purple heart, service ribbons carefully arranged beneath folded American flags. Samuel Brooks had served during this First World War. Beside the medals lay a short handwritten note. To whoever finds these, honor is never inherited. It is chosen every day. Protect this land only if your conscience allows you to sleep peacefully upon it. If not, leave it to someone better. Ethan remained silent for a long time. Shadow rested quietly beside him. Neither moved. Neither needed to. The velvet pouch contained only one object, a simple brass key, no label, no explanation, just a key worn smooth by another lifetime. Ethan smiled. Always one more mystery. He carefully repacked every document exactly as he had found it. Nothing inside the safe promised wealth beyond imagination. It promised something far more valuable. Proof, history, justice. Outside, snow began falling across Black Pine Ridge. Large white flakes drifted gently onto the repaired roof. For the first time in generations, the mansion no longer guarded a forgotten secret. It guarded the truth. And this time, the truth finally had someone willing to protect it. Winter settled gently over Black Pine Ridge. Fresh snow softened the broken stone walls and covered the scars left by years of neglect. Smoke rose steadily from the repaired chimney. For the first time in decades, the old mansion looked lived in, not perfect, not finished, alive. Weeks passed as Claire Donovan carefully submitted every document recovered from the hidden chamber to the court. Each original was photographed, authenticated, and compared against county archives. The results surprised even the state survey office. Entire sections of the Brooks property had disappeared from official maps nearly 70 years earlier. Boundary markers had been moved, records had been altered, supporting pages had quietly vanished from public files. Samuel Brooks had predicted exactly what would happen. The hidden chamber had preserved the only complete record. The signed confession from Gavin Mercer's grandfather proved impossible to dismiss. Combined with the original surveys and conservation agreements, it exposed decades of fraudulent land transfers. Several civil investigations followed. Neil Stanton's company immediately suspended its development proposal. Investors quietly withdrew. County officials announced an independent review of historical property records. No dramatic arrests filled the evening news. Justice moved the way it often did in real life, slowly, patiently. One verified document at a time. Months later, Gavin Mercer accepted a legal settlement restoring the disputed acreage to the Brooks estate. He also surrendered every remaining claim connected to Black Pine Ridge. When reporters asked for a statement outside the courthouse, Ethan simply replied, the land already knew who it belonged to. He walked away before anyone could ask another question. Spring arrived with melting snow and clear mountain streams. Walter Hayes returned almost every Saturday. Together, he and Ethan rebuilt the western porch using hand-cut cedar. Neither man talked much, neither needed to. Some friendships were built with hammers instead of words. Martha Collins planted wildflowers beneath the front windows. They'll come back every year, she said. So will I. Claire visited one afternoon carrying a final folder. It's finished. She handed Ethan the updated deed. Every original boundary had been legally restored. Every conservation right remained protected. Every fraudulent filing had been corrected. Ethan studied the papers only long enough to make sure one name remained unchanged. Brooks, he smiled. Daniel would have liked this. Claire nodded quietly. I think Samuel Brooks would have too. The hidden chamber remained exactly as Ethan had found it. The journals rested on cedar shelves, the medals stayed inside their wooden box, the brass key remained in the velvet pouch. Some histories deserved preservation more than display. Ethan donated copies of Samuel's engineering journals to the local historical society. The originals stayed inside the mountain, exactly where Samuel intended. By early summer, the mansion no longer resembled a ruin. Children from town sometimes stopped by with Walter to help paint fences. Neighbors shared extra lumber. Someone anonymously repaired the old stone well. Another neighbor rebuilt the front gate. Piece by piece, the mountain community restored more than a building. They restored a place that belonged to all of them. Shadow recovered more slowly. His limp never disappeared completely. Age had already begun catching up with him before the falling beam. Now each step carried a quiet stiffness. But every evening he still completed one slow patrol around the mansion before settling beside the front porch. One sunset, Ethan carried an old wooden chair onto the porch overlooking the valley. Shadow lowered himself beside it with a tired sigh. The mountain air smelled of pine and warm earth. Birdsong drifted through the trees where silence had once lived. Ethan reached down and rested his hand on Shadow's graying head. You found it? The old shepherd opened one eye. You knew before I did. Shadow answered with one slow wag of his tail. Far below, the restored creek shimmered beneath the evening sun. Protected forever by the water rights Samuel Brooks had hidden more than a century earlier. No luxury resort would ever replace these forests. No bulldozers would erase the valley. Children yet unborn would walk these trails without ever knowing how close they had come to disappearing. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For years he had believed the army had taught him that courage meant advancing into danger. Black Pine Ridge had taught him something different. Sometimes courage meant staying, repairing what others abandoned, protecting what others could not see. Choosing peace after surviving war. The evening breeze stirred the American flag hanging from the restored porch. Its quiet movement reminded Ethan of another flag folded carefully inside the hidden chamber below. One honored sacrifice, the other honored memory. Together they reminded him that a person's greatest inheritance was never measured in dollars. It was measured by what they chose to leave behind. As darkness settled over the mountain, Ethan rose to close the front door. Shadow followed him inside. The old mansion grew quiet once again, not with the loneliness of abandonment, but with the calm certainty that, after generations of waiting, Black Pine Ridge had finally become a home again. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple 1 in the comments, so we know you stayed with Ethan and Shadow until the very end. And tell us, what part of this journey meant the most to you? If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, loyalty, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next unforgettable adventure. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.